Alright, so here's our video 2 for Snowpocalypse. We just finished the Panama Canal, and now we're going to the Roosevelt Corollary. So, first of all, a corollary is like an addition to something. So it's like you're adding something on to something else. So the addition, what we're adding, Roosevelt's adding something to, is going to be the Monroe Doctrine, which hasn't really been as well enforced since the 1820s, or at least the idea has been there since the 1820s, but not well enforced until really imperial era. So America is becoming much more invested in Latin America. We want to be the protectors of Latin America and make sure that America remains the dominant force in Latin America, whether they like it or not. What we're finding by 1900 or so is that a lot of Latin American countries are also falling into financial trouble, especially with European creditors. In 1902, Great Britain dispatched Navy vessels to force Venezuela to pay a debt. So that's kind of where all it starts. In 1902, when Roosevelt's president, Venezuela was in deep debt with Great Britain, and so Britain sent out these ships to go basically force Venezuela to pay the debt off. Now, here's the problem. If Venezuela can't pay the debt, then that could lead to Britain taking that territory over. Because remember, this is also the age of imperialism, that we just watched Europeans dissect up Africa and Asia, so what's not to stop them from coming here to the Americas to do the same thing? So Roosevelt and many Americans are alarmed, like, we got to stop this from happening. We make sure that we stay dominant in Western Hemisphere, no new European colonies, essentially. So, in 1904, the same seemed likely to happen in Santo Domingo. So you see two situations where this is occurring, one in Venezuela, one in Santo Domingo in 1904. So in December of 1904, Roosevelt declared the U.S. would intervene whenever necessary. This leads to the Roosevelt Corollary. The corollary meant the U.S. would send gunboats to Latin America delinquent in their debt, and the U.S. would collect the debt in their own ports. So if you want to kind of summarize what this means, or what the Roosevelt Corollary means in a nutshell, is that America is going to now act as a police force in the Western Hemisphere. So that's the addition. America will act as a police force in the Western Hemisphere. So the old Monroe Doctrine said that, hey, Europeans can't come here and colonize anymore. The addition now is that America will also act as this third-party police force. So if some foreigner country like Britain or France has a debt that they're owed by Santo Domingo or Venezuela, what we'll do is that we'll send our ships, collect the debt for them, and then give it to them personally. That way, Britain never sends their ships here. We collect the debt on their behalf. That way, we ensure that we remain the dominant force here in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere in general, which is exactly what this does. So the Roosevelt Corollary exactly reflects this idea of big stick diplomacy. The idea that we are going to use military force or threat to get our things accomplished. Now, again, Latin Americans didn't really like this because, again, we're throwing our weight around without their approval, but hey, they can't do much about it. Here you see some cartoons demonstrate this. You see Roosevelt digging the canal here. You can see Roosevelt kind of marching, stomping around the Caribbean with his row of ships behind him. And down here you see Roosevelt literally dressed as a policeman, where on one side he has Europeans, and the other side he has Latin Americans, where he's kind of this intermediary person with the big stick right here in the picture. So all that's communicated in this imagery. So the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine would later justify sending troops to places like Haiti, Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Nicaragua, which would happen later on under other presidents too. So this mentality leads to poor relations with Latin American countries, but again, we had the ability to throw our weight around. They did not. So that is Roosevelt Corollary. Then you have East Asia, some issues with Asia under Roosevelt. In the 1900s, the U.S. and Japan were newer imperial powers. So like Europeans were old school imperial powers going back to like before America was being developed. And so that made our relationship between us and Japan more competitive, especially in the Pacific. So basically Japan and America are competing for dominating influence in the Pacific, who will be more dominant in terms of trade. So that kind of leads us to these various events here where things are getting kind of tense between us and Japan, which all this is going to kind of lead to our bombing of Pearl Harbor stuff down the road, but not right away, but later on. So first you have the Russo-Japanese War. In 1904, Japan was trying to expand itself into Asia, so was Russia, and they wanted some of the same territory, and so they go to war with each other. So 1904, and this only lasts a year, but 1904, Russia and Japan go to war with each other over trying to expand into some territory in Asia. Basically, Japan was much better prepared. They had more ships, better ships, more modern ships, and they won a lot of the earliest battles. The problem is with Japan, this is going to be an issue all the way to World War II, is that Japan has a limited amount of resources. So while they're better at fighting and they have a better military, if the war drags on for years, they can't win because they lack the resources to keep the war going on forever, essentially. So in 1905, Japan secretly reached out to Roosevelt and said, hey, can you mediate a deal to end this war, which he agreed to. So in 1905, Roosevelt brings the representatives of Russia and Japan to Portsmouth in America, where he's going to negotiate the Portsmouth Treaty, which you don't have to know all that, but basically Roosevelt ends the Russo-Japanese War. So these two parties agree to Roosevelt's terms, and he helps to end this war affecting Asia. And as a direct result, Roosevelt actually gets the Nobel Peace Prize. So in I think it's 05 or 06, Roosevelt will receive the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American to receive the Nobel Peace Prize because he helped bring about peace in this war. Then you have the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan a few years later. So another point of friction between us and Japan is that a lot of the Japanese people who came to America were segregated in the United States, especially in California. So like in California, they had white schools and you had Japanese schools. And just like in the South, Japanese schools were less than, they had less materials and resources and not treated well. So it made the Japanese government very upset how we treated the Japanese immigrants who came here. So in 1908, Roosevelt developed an informal deal with the Japanese government, hence the name Gentleman's Agreement. So a Gentleman's Agreement, just general definition of what this means, is that basically there's no official documentation. It's just two sides make a deal, shake hands on it, and move on. It's like you on the playground, right? You just make a deal with somebody else, shake hands, move on. That's a Gentleman's Agreement. So Roosevelt's Gentleman's Agreement was, we will stop segregation in California with the schools if Japan agrees to limit the amount of immigration of Japanese people come to America. So this was another way we restricted immigration to the country, was Japan agreed to limit its immigration to the United States if we agree to stop restricting or stop doing segregation in California schools, which we all agreed to. The final thing to say about Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, this is also where he left one of his biggest marks on foreign policy. Roosevelt obviously was big time in the military. He was a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had served in the Spanish-American War, and so he believed in very strong military, hence the name Speak Softly and Carry a Big Stick. So while he was president, he authorized the creation of a very modern set of battleships, hence the name Great White Fleet. So by the time he's wrapping up his presidency in 1907, you have 16 brand new battleships created, all painted white, hence the name. So 16 brand new ships are all finished, top of the line battleships, and so he sends them out on a cruise. The cruise lasts from 1907 to 1909. So the Great White Fleet cruise is where you have American ships go out to Europe, to Africa, to Asia, all around the world to demonstrate their top-of-the-line technology in their ships. So it's twofold, right? We have a tour of the ships to test them out, to show off what they got. But number two, probably most importantly, is also use this as an intimidation factor. Like, hey, look at America, look how strong we are, look how powerful we become, don't mess with us. And that's kind of the message of the Great White Fleet. And it's effective. In the 8 years almost 8 years Roosevelt's president, we don't fight any new wars, there's no battles, we don't get in conflicts, those kind of things. And so these intimidation factors, or these ideas of America, has a very strong military, seem at least prove to be effective for the time frame. All right, so we're gonna wrap up with one more guy. We're gonna go to Taft, and that's where we're gonna stop. We'll do Wilson when we get back to school. So anyway, here we go. We'll back up. I got one more thing to say about. Let's kind of wrap up Roosevelt real quick. So to wrap up Roosevelt, the purpose of the Great White Fleet and other big stick policies was to maintain peace and promoting peaceful solutions. So the whole point of the Great White Fleet and big stick policies was to maintain peace and promoting peaceful solutions. In 1906. Roosevelt organized a conference in Spain over a border dispute between Germany and France. So it's an example of how he helped mediate. Also, he helped direct U.S. involvement in the peace conference in Hague in 1907. So he was dedicated to peace through the demonstration of strong military presence as well too. So he does other things that are peaceful as well. All right, so Taft is the next guy. So Roosevelt could have very well run again in 1908. A lot of folks wanted him to run again. He could have been the first president to run for a third term and actually achieved it, because he was like, well, my first term wasn't really my own term, even though I served 3.5 years of McKinley's term. But he didn't want to break tradition, so he doesn't decide to run again in 1908, which he later regrets. But he basically picks he handpicks his successor, his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. This man right here, who is still to this day our largest president. So William Howard Taft will be a more mildly expansionist president. He is not as gung-ho about expansion like Roosevelt was, or even McKinley. And he wasn't so much in favor of using the military for diplomacy, but more about using investments in banking or money, hence the name dollar diplomacy. He wanted to support U.S. trade by protecting U.S. enterprises abroad. That's his goal. He wants to support U.S. trade by protecting enterprises abroad. All right, so let's talk about dollar diplomacy. Taft thought more private investments to China and Central America would lead to greater stability. It got hurt by growing anti-imperialism at home and overseas, but that's his policy. So basically, instead of using military intervention, let's use banks, investments, and government loans and those kind of things to help prop countries up that we support. That way, they'll do what we want them to do. So you have the railroads in China for first, or you have, I don't have that on the screen. I have East Asia on the screen, but we'll use that. It's fine. So for East Asia, Taft wanted U.S. bankers to be involved with Great Britain, France, and Germany investors in Chinese railroad development. Taft succeeded by getting American bankers to invest in development of these railroads in 1911. Russia and Japan did not want to get involved, but it does lead to more trade, which is what we wanted in general. So that was a good investment. Then you have Nicaragua. If you ever have an example about where dollar diplomacy was used, it was in Nicaragua. To protect U.S. investments, the U.S. sent money to help stabilize the government in Nicaragua. The Nicaraguan government was going bankrupt in 1911, and so Taft authorized U.S. banks to give heavy loans to Nicaragua to basically keep the government there in charge, because it was a government that was in favor to us. Now, people didn't like the fact that we were there intervening so much. In fact, because we sent ships to their ports to also help collect the debts. Like basically, we put American ships in Nicaraguan ports to make sure that we got our money paid back to us as well. So there was an uprising in Nicaragua. There were Nicaraguans who tried to basically attack us and get rid of us, and that didn't go over well. So what Taft does is he will send in Marines to protect this investment. So Taft will send in about 2,000 Marines into Nicaragua to make sure the government stays stabilized and to put down this rebellion. And as a result, we'll have troops staying in Nicaragua until 1930. So you can say with me again, Nicaragua, like Cuba and like Panama, becomes a protectorate underneath us as well, too. But that's our example of the dollar diplomacy, where we used investments to keep a government in charge that was pro-trade with the U.S. We didn't want to see it go to some other dictatorship or government that was not be pro-trade with the U.S. Then finally, you have the Lodge Corollary. So one of the most famous senators at the time, Henry Cabot Lodge, this man right here, from Massachusetts, he wanted to stop Japanese investments into Mexico. The Japanese were making heavy investments into the Baja Peninsula, that little weird peninsula that hangs off the west coast of Mexico. He wanted to stop their investments there because, again, he felt like it would interfere with Monroe Doctrine. So he and the Senate passed a resolution in 1912 stating that non-European powers would also be excluded from owning territory in the Western Hemisphere. So basically, the Monroe Doctrine only talked about Europeans. So the Lodge Corollary made by the senator under Taft, and this made Taft upset because it kind of overstepped the president. It basically said that non-Europeans also did not have the right to do investments or have a larger presence inside of the Western Hemisphere. So it upset Japan, it upset Taft, but it still got enforced, and that's pretty much it. So that ends foreign policy for Taft and Roosevelt. We'll stop there. And I'll see you Monday. Have a good weekend.